Hello and welcome. In this tutorial, we are going to be doing a brief introduction to hello and welcome. In this introduction, we're going to be doing a brief introduction to the simulation engine, specifically all the items that you can work with in the simulation engine to apply physics to these objects. So, as an example, this is using a rope tag, and then this is a cloth tag, has a cloth tag on it. So when we hit this and play it, right, we can actually have physics apply to these two objects. And so this tutorial is really just going to go over the basics. We're going to introduce the different objects, the basic way of working. We're not going to get super deep into the settings or anything like that, but I want to introduce all of these things and a couple of key elements that that make for interesting things to happen. Okay, so let's go ahead and create a new scene. Nope, not a new material. We'll create a new scene. Okay, so in this new scene, what I would like you to do is first we're going to start with cloth. And so we're going to go ahead and create a plane. And then we'll create a cube as well. And what we'd like to do is take the plane and lift it up above our cube. And I'm going to put garage shading lines on temporarily so we can kind of see what's going on before we get too far along with this process. And I'm going to rotate my view just a bit so we can kind of see that grid. All right, so cloth and anything that's soft body related. So there is a soft body dynamics, we'll talk about that as well, are going to be, their bendiness is limited by the number of polygons on their surface. So that's just something to note, and we'll look at examples of what that looks like as we go forward. So to start with, anything in the simulation engine requires a tag to be placed on it in order for us to actually simulate it and have physics apply to it. So if I right-click on my plane and I go down to simulation tags, you'll see down here there's rigid body, cloth, soft body, balloon, cloth belt, etc., etc. Right? There's pyro as well. That's awesome. We're not going to deal with pyro today, though. We're really going to be focusing on rigid body, cloth, soft body, and rope. And those will give us a pretty good introduction to how this functions. So what I want to do for this, it's going to be like a cloth. So I'd like to click cloth. Now, one thing to note, if I go ahead and right-click on this again, there are also these bullet tags. This is like the older system of physics, and it didn't integrate with anything else in the simulation tags, right? Before there was cloth, and these colliders just did not see each other. But now with the rigid body in here and soft body in here, we can actually have these things interact with one another, which is pretty great. So we have our cloth object. If I go ahead and hit play on my playhead down here, you'll see that it just drops straight through that cube, right? Because the cube is not part of the physics engine. And so I need some way of telling Cinema 4D that this cube should interact with this cloth. And in this case, right, if I was to apply another cloth tag to it, one, it would become flexible, and two, it would also drop into infinity. And so I want this to be locked in place in the scene, but have physics apply to it. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to right-click on my cube, I'm going to go to my simulation tags, and I'm going to go down to the very bottom one, which is a collider, and I'm going to apply that. So now with just the default settings for both of these things, I'm going to go ahead and hit play. And you can see, right, that my cloth is folding, sort of, over the edges of this thing. I also want you to note that the edges of the cube are sticking through a little bit. And so there are ways we can adjust that and fix that, but we're not going to worry. Again, this is very basic. We're not going to worry about too many settings right now. But one thing we can do is let's go ahead and take our plane, and instead of having that tag selected, we're going to go to the object, and let's increase our width and height segments to 40 in both directions. right? And now you're going to see that this folds a lot more like an actual cloth. And you'll see that the edges aren't quite poking through from the cube so much. We're in a pretty good space. So let's go ahead and stop this real quick. So something to note is that these simulations can, like, the more polygons we have, the smoother these simulations are going to work. Now, we can use some subdivision surfaces, and there's two types we could potentially use. First, if we just use a standard subdivision surface on the plane, right, we get a much smoother result. I do want you to note that, right, with a standard subdivision, right, these corners round, right? And even if I select my subdivision surface, right, there isn't necessarily a way to get those set, but you can kind of see we get like harder corners and kind of lumpy edges this way. I'm going to drop this down, or I think 1 was where it was set at to start with. Maybe I had it set to 0. We could see how this plays out. I'm going to turn display garage shading off, or lines off for the time being. I do want you to note that we get kind of a weird surface at this point, right? It's not quite what we would want. It looks a little bit strange. And so I'm going to go ahead and pop back to 0. Something else, the other option here is the cloth surface, where if I make my plane a child of the cloth surface, what it does is it applies a subdivision. So if I go back to display and turn lines on, you'll see it's more subdivided. And I can go here and I can actually increase this to, say, 2, right? So I can get a lot of subdivisions. And if I go ahead and hit play now, right, it's going to do a very similar effect. However, I do want you to note, right, the corners remain hard. That's one of the main differences. The other difference is the cloth surface allows us to add thickness. There's also this factor option, which I think if we dial that down in a different way, you can kind of see how it makes it either more rigid or more rounded. Limit basically makes it so it can't bend more than a certain amount. But then our thickness, right, if I was to increase this thickness, you can actually very quickly, kind of like the thicken generator, you can apply thickness to this cloth as well. And bulging just makes it a little bit more pillowy. And you can see how that, right, applies to our object. So we can get something that has even a greater thickness on it. So I'm going to go ahead and turn that off. I'm going to drop this down. When we're using Redshift, if I go to render this to the Redshift render view, and you'll see other things I've been working on, right, we're going to get, you can kind of see some waffliness in here, and it doesn't look really great. So let's go ahead and stop that and close this, but let's apply a simple material to this. So I'm going to go ahead and create a material. I'm going to apply it to the cloth. And I'm going to go ahead and change the color just to something a little more interesting, maybe. And then what I'd like to do is I want to essentially turn on tessellation on this object, right? If you remember, with the Redshift object, we can basically do a subdivision surface on our plane. So I'm going to pull the plane out from the cloth surface, and I'm actually going to drag this material down and put it on my cloth, on my plane. Now if I select the plane and I right click and I go to Render Tags and RS Object and go to my Geometry tab and check mark Override and Enable Tessellation, when I go to render this and hit this, I should get a much cleaner result. Now you're going to note, right, you can see that edge poking through the surface there, right? That's something that we have to fix with other things, but I get a much cleaner result. And what's nice about this is I don't have to have the cloth surface or subdivision surface on my object, which means I can have this lower polygon mesh as my base, and I only have to test render the higher polygon version, right? I don't have to have the editor playing this, which can get expensive if we have a lot of things in our scene. So I'm going to delete both of those, and we're just going to be using the Redshift Object tab on this. Right, so if I go through and play this, it should all play the same, right? And as I said before, it looks like it just, right, is going to probably stick through the corners there. Now, there's a couple of quick things we can do that without making any real changes that would help this. One, not having sharp corners on the cube. All right, if I turn fillet on, and then we go back and pop this back so I can see it. If I run this again, and then we render it, this should clean that up a little bit, right? It cleaned it up a bit. It's still pushing through. So there's some other settings we can do to make that change. So first I'm going to go ahead and select my cloth tag. And let's see here, where is it? Okay, so the setting I can adjust is this thickness. If I set this to, let's just go ahead and set it to 3 centimeters instead. I'm going to go ahead and pop this back and run this one more time. Right, so I've set that to 3 centimeters. If I render this, we can see if this is still sticking through the surface. And now it's not. Now something you'll note is that right around these corners, it seems like it's lifted up a little bit, and it's a little flatter on the top surface of the cube. If that becomes an issue with your scene, there are other things we can do. If we go to our collider, I want you to note that there's basically very simple settings here, right? We have bounce, friction, stick, and then what side we want this to collide on. And the front side is basically, right, the normal pointing outside of the object, right? That's where we want it to collide with in this case. If we had something inside a cube, right, that we wanted to say bounce around the inside of the cube, then we would want to do the back or maybe both. You can also exclude polygons. We're not going to do that right now. Okay. All right, so we've got this cloth, it falls into our scene and hits this collider. Let's look at another object real quick before we go any further with cloth. So I'm going to select my plane. I'm just going to go ahead and hide it. Okay, so let's go ahead and create a sphere. And let's bring the sphere up and actually zoom out a little bit and bring it up a little bit further. So let's see what a RigidBody does. So we're going to go ahead and right-click on our sphere, go down to Simulation, and select RigidBody. And now if I play this, the sphere drops and it hits and lands perfectly on top of this, and then it starts eventually tipping over and rolling. Right? And so there's very little bounce right now. It just seems like a very heavy object that lands on that surface. And I'm going to uncheck everything with the plane because I think it may still be trying to do that simulation too. Yeah, this seems to be working a little bit better. Okay, so I've got the this sphere here. If I select my RigidBody tag, you'll see that there's a bunch of different options available here. The first set is like when it should trigger. We're not going to worry about any of that right now. And there's some other things that, again, not so worried about. If we go down to our collision settings, though, or if we just click the collision tab, that's where a lot of the important settings are going to be. So this is where it would be, with cloth, it's kind of funny to use bounciness. But let's go ahead and set our bounciness here to 100, which is basically 100% bounciness. So now if I play this, right, that ball is going to bounce a lot. And it's actually even over what I would say is 100%. Let's set this to 25 or something like that. If we pop this back and go ahead and hit play, right, you can see that this is bouncing. Something else to note, right now we only have 90 frames of animation. I'm going to go ahead and set this to 300 so we get a little bit more range on what's happening here. So it's going to bounce, and you can see it just continuing to bounce, right? Even 25 is a lot. So we're going to go ahead and maybe we could just reduce this to 10. And then something to note is usually it's good to reset the timeline whenever you make one of these changes in order to see it apply. Because it doesn't really apply it until it loops anyway, right? So there's 10. And we have our normal collision shape, geometry accuracy. We're not going to worry about any of those things right now. If I go to the mass tab, there's things I can do here. I can decrease the density. We'll look at that in a second on a different object. We can check mark if it's hollow. In this case, that's not going to really matter, I don't think, but let's just see what it does. Yeah, it doesn't really seem to make a difference here. But one of the things we can add is, I'm going to stop this, jump it back, is a custom center. What that means is that our mass isn't perfectly aligned in the center of the object, right? Right now it's bouncing straight up and down because the mass is perfect. But if this is a real world object, it's most likely offset a little bit. Because this is a 200 centimeter sphere, I'm just going to offset this by 1 in the first direction there. And we're going to go ahead and hit play. And I want you to see right now it's starting to get a little bit more bouncy, right? This feels a little bit more real because things typically don't bounce perfectly up and down. They always are off balance a little bit. And also they usually don't come right straight down. They have a little bit of a kind of force that in a different direction. But in this case, we're just going to let it bounce like this. But if we have a little bit of offset like that, we can get some interesting results. Okay. So we've got our sphere set up as a rigid body. Let's go ahead and turn that off. And let's create a cube. And we're going to go ahead and lift this cube up. Let's make the cube a little bit smaller in all 3 dimensions. So I'm just going to use the scale. And I'm going to, oh, well, it doesn't, I guess it doesn't matter. I'm just going to scale this down this way and this way, make it a little bit smaller. And for this, I'm going to put a Softbody tag on here. So I'm going to right click on this. I'm going to go ahead and go down to simulation tags and go to Softbody, which looks like a jellyfish. And then I'm going to go ahead and hit play. Right? And as you see right now, it looks like a rigid body, right? It's falling and bouncing a little bit, but it's very, very rigid. Now, in this case, the issue is the number of segments. The way that soft bodies work, right, is that they're essentially creating like springs and things between different vertices and different across the surface of this object. And when you only have one per side, it gets a little bit stiff. So let's go ahead and set this to 10 in all directions. Okay, so now we've got, right, something that looks a little bit more gelatinous and flexy when it bounces. You can see that it still stays rigid, and what I might do is I'm going to go ahead and go back to the first frame, hit the letter E, and I'm going to scoot this up even further so it bounces a little bit further, right? And so now we can select our soft body tag, and you'll note that there's this surface. And we have a bunch of settings available here. We also have our soft body and balloon and all of that. Under soft body, we have some, a bunch of different possible settings that we'll start looking at some of these. But let's start with the surface. So first, let's see what happens if we increase our bounciness to 10. And let's just jump back to the beginning. Right? It changes things a little bit. If I increase my bendiness to 10, you'll notice immediately, right, it starts to make a very different result happen. If I set this to 1 instead, let's see what we get, right? It actually pops back up a little bit. And so you can see that it's pretty easy to make some adjustments in terms of how this thing works. Right, so if I increase my bounciness to 100, let's see what happens. Right, so that just totally crashed. Okay, so my hierarchy may look a little different because Cinema crashed on me. And so I was partway through talking about soft bodies. I set the bounciness of the soft body to 100 and it crashed. It blew up and went crazy. So this is something to note. It's always good, especially if you've been working on something for a while, to save it frequently. I had not saved that at all. And so I lost it. But I wasn't working on it for very long either, so it's fine. All right, so with the soft body, if we continue where that one left off, bounciness of 100 was probably a bad idea. I'm going to do 25 and just see what happens there. I'm going to go ahead and hit right? And so you can see that that sets there. If I go to the Softbody tag, it looks like I have, where is it? Here we go. Softbody, draw when selected. I'm going to turn. So these, what it's doing is it's showing those internal springs or whatever connections inside the Softbody that's resulting in this acting the way it's acting. So I'm going to go ahead and turn that off because that is going to save some stuff, right? And so I've got this little jiggly cube bouncing along. Again, if we go to our surface, and it's probably wise to stop this and jump to frame 0. If I increase my stretchiness to 5 or something like that, you can see that, right, it does a little bit different things, right? Stretchiness and bendiness both work slightly differently. If you're familiar with vertex maps, you can actually create vertex maps to say which areas should be stiffer and which areas should be more bendy or less or more stretchy or more bouncy or whatever. There's a lot of depth into what you can do with this. So that's the Softbody, right? Now, I do want you to note that RigidBody is like the least expensive simulation, right? Softbody, cloth, all of that is more expensive in terms of what your computer can handle. So, oh, that's a really nice frame. So there's another thing I want to another tag I want to show you that's like Softbody but slightly different, and that is the balloon tag. So if I go ahead and delete this Softbody tag off the cube, and I right-click on here, and I come back down to simulation, I go down to balloon. What balloon allows you to do, note this tag, the surface tag, looks exactly the same. Those are all the same settings. But then there's this balloon tag next to it. And if I have balloon turned on, if I just go ahead and play this as it stands, I'm going to jump backwards in time, right? It looks pretty much like a Softbody. It's a little bit more floppy by default. If I go ahead and stop this and jump back to frame 0, and then if I set my overpressure to 10, and I go ahead and play this, right? Now it actually expands into a huge balloon, and you can see that there's this expansion time in frames, right? So it takes 30 frames for it to go from 0 to full, right? And you could set that to 1 frame, so it's like instantaneously full. There's, lots of things you could do. I could also, right, stop this and, maybe drop my overpressure to 5 and see what we get here. Right, and so it's like a little bit less full, a little bit more squishy. You'll note that there is a Softbody tag here, and I can actually switch between the two of them. We're not going to worry too much about that right now. We're not going to worry about deformation or the dresser or any of these other things in our current setup. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and pause this, and we're going to hide our balloon entirely. Because we're going to go ahead and put a cloth back in here. So if you already have your cloth in here, great. I'm also going to get rid of the cube collider, right? So I just need to go ahead and create a plane, and I need to set my width and height to 40, which is what it was before. And I'm going to lift this thing up a little bit, recenter my view, and apply a cloth tag. Now, previously, right, we used the sorry, where is it? There it is. Right, we needed to have a collider set in order for this cloth to have something to collide with. One of the other cool things about cloth is you can use the dresser to define points that should essentially be pinned in place. And so, but what we need to do in order for that to happen is I need to make this plane editable. Right. Currently, it's a primitive, and so I can't access the individual points. So I need to make it an editable plane. So I'm going to go ahead and make this editable. Note that the cloth tag is still there. It hasn't changed. And now I'm going to go to points mode so I can see all of my points. And I'm going to go to this dresser tab. And you'll see that there are several options in here. We're not going to worry about dress state or a knit state or seam polys or any of that right now. We're just going to be focusing on this fix points tag. And so what we need to do is we need to select the points we want to fix in place. And we're just going to use 4. And I could go into the top view, maybe. which for some reason I can't see my plane at all. I'm not 100% sure what just happened, but it looks like Cinema may have crashed on me again. Okay, that was weird. So I'm going to go ahead and hit S so I can see this full screen. Let's see what happens if I change views. Huh. This is an interesting bug. Let's see if I play this playhead. There we go. Great. Okay, I'm going to go back to 0. If that's happening for you as well, it looks like hitting play will redraw the screen. It may be something where you can come up here and you can just go to redraw or hit the letter A, and it may redraw it as well. So I'm not going to choose the far corners. I'm just going to go ahead and maybe go 3 in each corner, right? So we have just a little, they're like, these points are close to the edge. So I've held down Shift to select all 4 of those points. And now, and you can do as many points as you want. You can select whichever ones you want, but this, for this next little demo, this is going to work the best. So I've got those 4 points set. I'm going to go to my cloth tag, and I'm going to go to dresser, and I'm going to click set. When I do that, you'll see that these points become magenta in color. And if I go back to my main view, let's hit the letter A and see if that does redraw it. Perfect, that worked. So if I hit the letter A, that redraws it. And now if I go ahead and hit play forward, right, you'll see that this cloth is hanging by those points, right? This is great for things like curtains, or, you know, there's lots of other reasons why you would, you know, potentially want to use this, right? Capes, things like that, draping, anything. Also, right, if you're having some collision issues with, say, a cube that you're using as a table, you could basically pin your points just above the tabletop in the corners to try and keep that from going through. There's other ways you could set some settings in the physics engine to make that nicer, but we're not going to worry about that right now. All right, we're just looking at how we get these basics done. So, all right, so we've got our cloth pinned up. Let's go ahead and look at the rope simulator. And again, we're just going to do something very simple with this. We're going to go ahead and we're going to create a circle spline. Then we are going to take that circle spline, we're going to right click on it, and we are going to go to simulation tags and add a rope tag to it. And we are going to say, okay, our circle is huge. Let's go ahead and select the circle, go to the object tab. Let's make this like 50 centimeters. No, let's do 100. And then let's set it so it's aligned with our cloth. Now, we're just going to leave this as a spline right now, and we're going to go ahead and hit play. And I want you to see that, right, our spline has hit and bounced and is like actually aligning with the top surface of our cloth, right? And it's actually impacting the cloth as it hits it. So how do we make use of this? So what we can do is, right, this is a spline. Anything we can use a spline for, we can then, right, can become rope. Now, the easiest way to do that is for us to create a sweep. And so what we're going to do is we're going to create a second circle. And this circle, let's go ahead and make this 3 centimeters in diameter. Or, sorry, radius of 3, so 6 centimeters in diameter. We're going to leave it at the current orientation. And then let's go ahead and create a sweep. And we'll make these 2 things the children of the sweep. And if everything is set the way, just by the defaults there, it should look like an actual circle. If it doesn't, then you probably just need to switch the plane that your circle 1 is in. And you just want to make sure, right, that the big circle is the one that's on the bottom, right? Okay. So if I go ahead and play this now, right, you'll see that I get this in here, but you'll see it's kind of floating into the cloth, right? And it kind of drifts around there. And the reason for that is that the rope simulator has a radius, right? And that radius is 0.5 centimeter. And what that means is that basically 0.5 centimeter in any direction from the spline itself is where that collision is going to take place. And because we have this is a radius of 3, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to set that to at least 3. So I'm going to set it to 3. I'm going to jump this back up. We're going to run this again. Right? It's still going through that surface a little bit, right? There's some collision issues there. Again, we could probably set the thickness on our cloth a little bit thicker as well, or we could increase the thickness here. And that's like the first step to resolving some of those issues. So I'm going to go ahead and maybe on my cloth tag, let's go to surface and let's set our thickness to, let's just set it to 3. And just see if that helps us out a little bit, if it doesn't quite go all the way through. It's still going through a little bit. Now, one of the other issues that we're not having quite yet, but I had earlier when I was testing this, let's go ahead and is what happens when our when we have a little bit more force behind this ring falling through. So if I go ahead and hit play, right, you can see it's bouncing through the bottom surface of my plane. Now, the other option is I may want to be drawing these in a different order. So one of the things that happens with Cinema 4D is the way the hierarchy works is that whatever's on top gets generated first. So if I take this plane and bring it up above and make sure I'm in object mode and go back here and play, right, I'm still getting the same result, right? So it's pushing through, it's going a little bit too far, but it is catching on that surface. There's one other thing we can attempt to do, which is to select our rope and to come down here and set our mass to something lower than 1, right? So I'm going to go ahead and stop this. I'm going to just set this to 0.1, right? So it's a lot lighter than it was before. If I go ahead and hit play, right, I want you to note that now, right, it doesn't have quite such an impact when it hits that cloth, and it doesn't penetrate quite as much. But we're still having some issues with penetration. So how do we resolve that? The way we do that is we're going to go to Edit, and we're going to go to Project Settings. Under Project Settings, there's this Simulation tag. I want to click on that. And there's a bunch of settings here. There's smoothing iterations, there's sub-steps, there's different passes. All of these things come together to make this, to basically fix this. And what's happening is this is hitting the surface fast enough that it's kind of pushing through. It's not popping all the way through, which can happen as well, but it is pushing through. So we can try to up different things. And if you right click on one of these and go to show help, the help menu is really actually pretty helpful in this setting. It basically goes through and talks through all of what you need to do. And so, and I think it even talks about which one you should do first. And so let's go ahead and see if we just up the level of sub-steps, and right, it does take longer calculation times. And so what it does is basically, right, each one of the frames, we're running at like 30 frames a second or something like that, right? With each frame, it basically is doing 20 calculations per frame, right? If I set this to, let's just set this to 30 calculations and see what happens here, right? That's a little bit less that's happening. Let's go ahead and increase our iterations to 2. You can see that goes a lot slower, right? So it may be good to have our sub-steps, right, first as our first line of defense against this. And let's go ahead and stop this, run this again. Let's just see what we get, right? So it's still intersecting a bit. And this is something where, you know, if it intersects a little bit while we're doing this, it's not the end of the world, right? It's something where maybe at the end, when you go to render everything, you want to like boost it up and get it perfect. But as you're testing things and getting things going, if it pushes through a little bit, it's not the end of the world. And you can always, if you're just doing, you know, still things, you can always find a frame where, you know, it is in the state that you want it to be. In the next tutorial, we're going to look more at how to use a particle emitter and apply the simulation tags to that. I still need to do one on the pyro, and we'll look at a couple more advanced features.